December 11, 2010. A cadaver dog searching the dunes at Gilgo Beach stopped suddenly and refused to move. Officer John Malia shined his flashlight into the brush. There, tangled in burlap, was a woman's body. Within days, 3 more were found. 4 young women. 4 lives. All discarded along the same lonely stretch of sand. They would become known as the Gilgo 4. But this was no isolated crime scene. The search uncovered more remains scattered for miles, 11 bodies in all. And for over a decade, the killer's identity stayed buried in the sand. Then, in July 2023, police arrested a man no one expected. Rex Heuermann, an architect, a husband, a father. How did a suburban father, living just 20 miles away, evade investigators for nearly 20 years? And what secrets still lie hidden in the sand? Welcome to Vanished Voices, where real crime unfolds in plain sight. Today we're examining one of the most baffling serial murder cases in American history, the Gilgo Beach killings. For over a decade, remains of women were found hidden along Long Island's shore, dismissed as mysteries. Then in July 2023, everything changed. A suburban architect was arrested and branded the architect of death. Stay with us as we meet the victims and trace how a pattern emerged. Clues were uncovered, and this quiet man's life unraveled under the weight of evidence. Long Island, New York, a place of contrasts. On one end, New York City, a metropolis that never sleeps, fueled by ambition and light. On the other, just an hour's drive east, stretches of quiet marshland, winding parkways, and beaches where the Atlantic meets the land in slow, restless waves. It is here, along Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach, where luxury waterfront homes stand just miles from isolated patches of sand and thicket. A strip of land so narrow, at points you can hear waves crashing from both directions, ocean to the south, bay to the north. For years it was just another stretch of Long Island coastline, until December 2010, when it became the center of one of the most disturbing investigations in American criminal history. To understand what investigators eventually uncovered, we need to go back, before the headlines, before the search dogs, before the name Gilgo Beach was tied forever to murder. We need to know the women, their lives, their families, their choices, and the silence their absence left behind. July 2007. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, just 25 years old, left her home in Norwich, Connecticut. A mother of 2, she was described as bright, witty, and determined to provide for her children. That summer, bills stacked higher than she could manage, and she turned to escort work advertised through Craigslist. Her sister later recalled their last phone call. Maureen said she was heading into New York City for an overnight trip, one she promised would be quick. She never came home. In the days that followed, unanswered calls and silence set in. Her family filed a missing persons report. For years she was a name on a list of missing women, and then, nothing. 2 years later, in 2009, another young woman disappeared. Melissa Barthelemy was 24. Originally from Buffalo, she had moved to New York City with hopes of building a life for herself. She too advertised escort services on Craigslist. On July 12, Melissa left her apartment in the Bronx. She was never seen alive again. Days later, her teenage sister began receiving chilling phone calls. The voice was male. The words were cruel. He used Melissa's own phone to taunt her family, telling them she was dead, mocking their grief. The calls were traced to areas in Manhattan and Massapequa on Long Island. Then the phone went dark forever. June 2010. Megan Waterman was 22 years old and living in Maine. She had a 3-year-old daughter, whom relatives said she adored. On June 5, Megan traveled to Long Island. She checked into the Holiday Inn Express in Hauppauge, just off the highway. That night, security cameras captured her walking out of the hotel lobby and into the night. She carried only her phone. She never returned. Megan's family was left to raise her daughter, while police searched with few leads. Just 3 months later, September 2010, Amber Lynn Costello vanished. At 27, she had struggled with addiction but was described by friends as funny, spirited, and protective of those she loved. She lived in West Babylon, Long Island, and like the others, sometimes arranged dates online. On the night she disappeared, her roommate recalled a new client had contacted Amber, offering unusually high payment for her services. She left the house. She never returned. That roommate would later describe details of the man's truck, clues investigators would cling to years later. By December 2010, when police searching for another missing woman stumbled across the first set of remains in Gilgo Beach, all 4 women, Maureen, Melissa, Megan, and Amber, were located within days, buried in burlap, their bodies arranged along the brush near Ocean Parkway. They would be forever known as the Gilgo 4. Different towns, different months, different years. But their fates ended along the same windswept stretch of beach. And yet, for more than a decade, the question remained: who had ended their lives? The answer lived just miles away. In a quiet neighborhood of Massapequa Park stood a red-roofed house, weathered but ordinary. Inside was Rex Heuermann, a man few suspected. An architect commuting daily to Manhattan, raising a family, walking the same sidewalks as his neighbors. Some described him as quiet, others as awkward. Almost no one imagined he was tied to the women whose bodies lay along the sand. But before investigators reached his name, the story belonged to the women. To Maureen's children left without their mother. To Melissa's sister who answered taunting calls that no teenager should ever hear. To Megan's daughter, growing up with only photographs. To Amber's family, clinging to the memory of her laughter. Each woman's life left an echo, now bound together by geography, circumstance, and tragedy. 4 women, 4 stories that converged on one desolate stretch of Long Island sand. Their discovery in December 2010 would ignite an investigation that stretched across years, unmasking hidden lives, missed opportunities, and eventually, a suspect hiding in plain sight. The question was no longer whether a serial predator was at work, it was whether he could be caught. By December 2010, police were searching for a missing woman named Shannon Gilbert. She had vanished in May after calling 911 and saying she was being chased. Her words trailing off in static. But instead of finding Shannon, officers stumbled upon Maureen Brainerd Barnes, one of 4 bodies buried in burlap on Gilgo Beach. Within days, the remains of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello were also found, each wrapped in similar cloth and placed in close proximity along the brush-covered dunes near Ocean Parkway. What began as a search for a missing person had become the shock of a serial discovery. The media attention was fierce. Even months later, journalists and family members would hold candles at dusk along that same stretch of sand. Then, in the spring of 2011, March and April, investigators uncovered more remains. There was Valerie Mack, identified through DNA in 2020, who had vanished in 1996. At the time, she was known only as Jane Doe. Jessica Taylor's body was also discovered, a young woman who disappeared that same winter. Summer pushed forward, and in July 2011, the discoveries continued. Skeletal remains, belonging to at least 1 toddler and multiple unidentified women were found among the dunes. Some remains were wrapped, others found unadorned. The number of dead grew, but so did the questions. Here was a shoreline littered not with driftwood, but with human stories buried in sand. Why Grand River Parkway? Why Ocean Parkway? Why were these women placed within mere yards of each other, yet disappeared years apart? The women's backgrounds were varied, but a thread connected most of them. They had advertised escort services via Craigslist. The digital footprints led to a common landscape of vulnerability and opportunity, and they vanished with little trace. Each new set of remains raised more questions. Were these connected murders, or coincidental crimes? Some women were bound, wrapped, carefully buried, others not. Why did methods vary? Was there a signature, or multiple perpetrators? Investigators consulted experts. They combed the shoreline with cadaver dogs. They trawled emotive phone logs, interviewed family and friends. Yet with each theory, another clue slowed them down. In public, detectives spoke of pattern and caution. Behind closed doors, they questioned assumptions. Was the timeline spanning years or decades? Did the perpetrator strike when opportunity met abandonment? Or was it someone with knowledge of the terrain, of police unmarked routes? As press conferences mounted, people began to worry for other missing women. Were their bodies still undiscovered? The beach had become a node of terror, rather than a place of calm retreat. In the summer of 2011, investigators found yet another set of remains, this time of a toddler. DNA identified her years later as Baby Doe, her case haunting because her identity remained unknown for so long. A child, lost in the same sand that had swallowed so many adult secrets. The coldness of that shoreline held silence, but beneath it lay echoes of lives erased. Of a killer able to bury not only bodies but also the time and place they vanished. Even now, years later, law enforcement continues scanning shoreline crevices, reviewing old case files, hoping to link missing women to this pattern to do justice. Each discovery brings urgency, but speaks to how long a killer can elude capture. And that brings us to the moment the investigation turned in a new direction. An arrest in July 2023 that linked all these deaths. A local architect, Rex Heuermann. Soon after the bodies were found at Gilgo Beach in December 2010, local police called in reinforcements. A task force formed. Suffolk County detectives, the FBI, and New York State troopers. Their goal, unravel the worst series of discovered bodies Long Island had ever seen. The first pieces of physical evidence arrived quickly. Each body had been wrapped in burlap, secured with a belt bearing a worn label, the letters HMM, or WH. Investigators noted small traces of DNA on the fabric remnants, but they were faint. This evidence, combined with details from cell phone logs and toll records, shaped an early, desperate map of what had happened. At that time, genetic sequencing and forensic genealogy were not tools that law enforcement could routinely use. This was before cold case breakthrough techniques became mainstream. Investigators were handicapped, forced to rely on trace DNA, witness accounts, and physical evidence alone. Meanwhile, families of the missing women pushed forward. They held vigils at the beach and lobbied for attention. In the press, reporters questioned the pace of progress. Headlines asked, "Are we missing the clues? How many bodies before a pattern emerges?" Community meetings grew tense, remarks turning into frank accusatory statements about lack of action. As the summer haze turned to fall, the focus swung to potential suspects. Some townspeople whispered about James Burke, a disgraced former police chief based on prior allegations and geographic proximity. He was never formally charged, but suspicion swirled. Another person of interest was John Bitrolf, a local man later convicted for murders in Suffolk County. His name surfaced early due to similarities in victim profiles and location. However, DNA evidence and timelines ultimately cleared him in the Gilgo Beach cases. Weeks turned into months. Investigators followed up on every lead, interviewing men who answered Craigslist ads, shadowing implicated vehicles, sifting through marina rosters. But each path ended in uncertainty. The killer had vanished. Someday, experts told the task force, DNA genealogy would move from fringe to front line. Someday. That someday arrived almost a decade later. By 2020, tools for forensic genealogy had progressed. DNA from previously unnamed victims, including a woman known only as Jane Doe, were processed through genealogical databases. Investigators identified her as Valerie Mack, a mother of two, missing since 1996. Karen Vergata, missing since 2000, was also confirmed. Family members sighed with relief and grief. They finally had names to attach to memory. More than that, investigators were no longer working in the dark. Yet, even as new identifications strengthened the case, questions persisted. Were these victims connected to the Gilgo 4 or separate crimes? Was a single killer at work for decades? Or multiple individuals disposing bodies in the same corridor? Public pressure remained fierce. The Long Island community demanded answers. Local radio shows played audio of investigators describing patterns. Op-eds questioned how a body could lie undiscovered for years, yet remain so close to homes. Fear seeped into daily routines. Parents warned children not to stray near walkways or wooded edges. Investigators responded by racing to update older missing person files, cross-checking names with missing advertisements, bank activity, travel logs. Long unused phone towers and toll booth records were re-examined. Every ping could be a timeline marker. Then, one day, an older Lakewood file caught a detective's eye. The software had matched a trove of hair fibers from a burlap bag to a known individual. It was a flicker of clarity among years of static, but it was enough to reopen the possibility that the killer had hidden in plain sight all along. As the investigation continued, detectives grappled not only with the growing list of victims, but with impossible possibilities. Which theory fit the evidence? Some believed one person was unlikely. The bodies varied. Some were carefully wrapped in burlap and placed gently into shallow graves. Others were less arranged. The victims disappeared over a span of several years and across Long Island's shoreline. Could this have been the work of more than one predator operating independently? In one scenario, a localized killer moved bodies through particular dunes. In another, an opportunistic criminal dumped bodies where they would likely be found, or left unburied. This theory suggested overlapping behaviors. with some victims linked more by geography than by the killer's signature. Another line of thought captured the imaginations of profilers. What if one person committed all these killings, and his method changed over time, wrapping victims in burlap at first, then abandoning bodies more openly later? Perhaps killing patterns shifted to reduce risk or to adapt as law enforcement grew more suspicious. If that was so, profiling and timeline analysis would become critical. The question was, did one individual fuel his confidence over time and grow bolder, or did disposal methods shift due to availability of materials, changing opportunity, even urgency? Long Island's shifting beach topography may have influenced placement patterns too. Then, shockingly, in mid-2023, a new suspect appeared in the investigation, Rex Heuermann, a 59-year-old architect living just miles from the crime scenes, in Massapequa Park. Examining phone tower logs, investigators discovered a series of burner phones used to place advertisements by some victims, and sometimes used to contact their families. One of those burner devices pinged near Heuermann's home and his Manhattan office, consistent with movements he likely regularly made. The investigation took another step when a strand of hair found in one of the burlap wrappings was tested and matched to Heuermann's wife, or someone close in the household. That raised immediate questions. How did it get into the crime scene unless through someone who lived with him? But the key breakthrough came when DNA from a pizza crust discarded in New York City matched Heuermann's DNA, and additional genetic material tied him to one of the crime scenes. The pizza crust matched hair from two of the victims, placing him, at least genetically, in connection with them. When word broke that Heuermann was the suspect in connection with 7 counts of murder, neighbors were stunned. He had kept to himself. Neighbors described him as awkward, quiet, odd even, but harmless. He took long commutes into Manhattan as an architect, but nothing suggested he could be behind such a string of deaths. One neighbor, when asked if they would have suspected, said simply, "He mowed his lawn and kept to himself." A quiet face on a cul-de-sac now associated with one of the nation's most baffling cold case crimes. So which theory fits? Were there multiple people dumping bodies at the beach, or did one man methodically adapt over time? And how deeply did investigative errors or untested technology conceal clues? Heuermann's emergence turned theory into prosecution, but even then, questions remained. Next, we'll explore exactly how investigators tied these pieces together, by reconstructing the breakthrough in crime scene forensics and courtroom strategy. July 14, 2023. A warm summer afternoon in Manhattan's financial district. A black SUV pulls up in front of a modest high-rise. 2 plainclothes detectives step out. Inside the building, architect and family man Rex Heuermann, 59, pauses behind his drafting desk. Minutes later, he is handcuffed and read his rights. The charges were immediate and staggering. Heuermann was accused of killing 4 women, part of the Gilgo Beach cases, but investigators soon added 3 more victims to the count, bringing the total to 7 alleged murders across 2 decades. Within hours, photos of Heuermann's arrest swept across screens. Social media lit up with conjecture, some highlighting his career, others showing the homes he designed. The narrative shifted instantly. The long quiet suspect was now a public figure entwined with a long unsolved nightmare. As Heuermann was booked and held without bail, Suffolk County prosecutors held a press conference, confirming that he was charged with the deaths of Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Barthélemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello, Valerie Mack, Karen Vergata, and Baby Doe. Additional homicide charges were expected as investigations continued, leaving the final number unsettled. In court, the prosecution laid out their case. But it would not unfold without drama. Defense attorneys seized on a key point. The DNA techniques used to link Heuermann to the scenes had relied on software that some scientific communities had only recently begun validating. Specifically, the program used for familial DNA matches had experienced glitches, according to the defense. It was the kind of careful technical critique that could sway a jury or delay a verdict. Moreover, Heuermann's lawyers asked the judge to divide the case into separate trials, one for the Gilgo 4, another for the additional 3 victims. Their argument, jurors could become overwhelmed and biased if asked to judge 7 deaths at once. Prosecutors countered that the crimes were linked by geography, victim profiles, and forensic evidence, insisting a single trial made sense. The legal battle became a sparring match over DNA reliability in trial format. Cases building in complexity before the public even saw a courtroom witness. Meanwhile, the human toll unfolded behind closed doors. Heuermann's wife filed for divorce almost immediately after the arrest. People magazine reported the filing, citing betrayal and loss of trust. The household foundation, once untouched, now fractured under media scrutiny. Their daughter, Victoria, stepped into view. In a public statement, she said she believed her father was guilty, and that the truth mattered more than preserving an illusion. It was a heartbreaking admission in front of cameras and microphones. A child forced to choose between loyalty and truth. Throughout these developments, courtroom observers described a sense of a storm gathering, but not one erupting. Heuermann sat in a navy suit, expression unreadable. His defense team paced, prepared to question DNA reliability. Prosecutors in turn assured evidence would withstand scrutiny and tie Heuermann to each victim. Much of the state's case rested on genetic evidence. Prosecutors emphasized that multiple DNA sources, the hair fiber, the pizza crust, and cell phone geolocation logs, formed a consistent timeline. Each link was independent but pointed toward one man. Beyond the courtroom, public reaction was raw and vocal. At candlelight vigils on Gilgo Beach, other families held photographs of women still missing. Bystanders placed flowers in the sand. Many said they finally had someone to point to. But not relief, not yet. News outlets ran once quiet neighborhood footage of Heuermann's house. School PTA groups debated if architectural designs he submitted were now symbols of betrayal. The press coverage teetered between reporting facts and dredging memories. As attorneys hashed out trial logistics, the question hanging in the courtroom echoed. Beyond it, could DNA technology, debated and dissected, hold up to jury scrutiny? Could each of the 7 deaths stand as independent charges, or would the defense isolate one case to muddy connection? In defense filings, lawyers argued the software used to generate matches was evolving, not universally accepted at the time of analysis. Prosecutors responded with expert witnesses, geneticists, pathologists, prepared to explain how FBI protocols and lab validations upheld every piece of evidence. Every hearing raised stakes higher, each delay extended grief. Every procedural motion threatened to push the trial into another year. Meanwhile, families waited. Reporters pressed for dates. The public watched, torn between hope for justice and dread of delay. On the day of arraignment, Heuermann stood motionless, bound by chains and tablets of evidence. The judge set a trial date for sometime in 2026. Until then, the case remained unsolved, steeped in forensic debate, federal motions, and the heartache of families still waiting. Next, we'll walk through the forensic reconstruction, the lab breakthroughs, courtroom drama, and the strategy that may finally bring truth to light. Even after the arrest of Rex Heuermann and the stacking of 7 charges, the shoreline of Gilgo Beach continues under layers of questions, some answered, others still unanswered. This stretch of sand remains stained not only by death, but by uncertainty. Among the bodies discovered in 2011 were remains of women who never received names. The most well-known, a young woman referred to as Asian Doe. Despite commendable efforts by investigators and forensic artists, she has not yet been identified. Another was called Baby Doe, a toddler whose remains were found wrapped in a blanket. Her tiny fingers and toes were missing, identified only years later through DNA as a small child whose identity remains unknown. A harrowing reminder that the death toll may be deeper than known. These unidentified victims became faces on missing posters and sketches on police boards. Families of the missing watched, hoping one day identity would arrive, bringing at least the possibility of mourning. Amid all the known victims, Shannon Gilbert stands apart. In May 2010, she went missing after a 911 call stating, "He's after me," as she fled into marshland after a car stopped in water. Her body was recovered in December that year, just off Ocean Parkway, but the circumstances of her death remain under debate. The medical examiner ruled her death accidental, likely drowning, but many, including her family and community members, questioned if she was another victim of the same killer linked to the Gilgo 4. Was she fleeing him? Or was she a tragic accident? Investigators continued to patrol the marsh at night, cameras rolling long after daylight faded. Her case remains at the edge of this tragedy, unresolved. Now convicted of 7 murders, if proven in trial, Heuermann may not be the only person responsible. The differences in victim treatment and the discovery of remains across varied times raise a fundamental question: did he act alone? Some believe others may have been involved, or that the body locations include unauthorized dumping zones used by multiple individuals. Could some victims date back further than initially thought? Valerie Mack disappeared in 1996. Baby Doe's identity remains unknown. There may be victims whose bodies were washed away or buried too deeply to find. Heuermann's arrest brought relief to many, but not closure. Families of Asian Doe, Baby Doe, and Shannon Gilbert still wait for answers. Investigators continue walking the dunes, scanning cell tower records for anomalies, and updating missing person databases in hope of breaking another deadlock. In court, the defense has tried to frame the case as specific to the identified victims, not covering these unresolved cases. Prosecutors counter that the breadth of missing persons and disposal locations indicate a wider scope of crimes. Yet, without identification or DNA, investigators have limited leverage. Next to candles, whispering the question, "Who were you?" For families caught in a limbo of grief without names, the absence is a living wound. Criminal justice experts note that rural and coastal dump sites often hide more victims, even after an arrest. To them, Gilgo Beach is not complete, not by evidence and not by sorrow. Legally, these unresolved angles may complicate appeals, may spur procedural requests, and may become new threads in discovery. Investigators have not closed the file, they've only added layers. Despite the arrest and prosecution of Rex Heuermann, the sands of Gilgo Beach still hold their silence. Families still cling to photos and fragments, investigators still sift logs and dunes. Until every name is known, until every life is accounted for, the shore remains unsettled. Thank you for watching. If this case intrigued you, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification button for more true crime documentaries.